start, I'd like to get a sense of, for those in the room, how many of you are artists or artist appreciators? Do we have artists in the room? 2 artists? Okay. So I'm mainly talking to artists and designers and organizers, and I give this talk called Artist as Advocate, which I've been working on for a couple of years. I've given the talk in Italy and in Spain, and also here within South Florida at the Frank and Locust Projects in Miami. And what I like to do is I talk about my own work, and then I talk about how I work with institutions and the institution that I work for. And I always tell artists that you should consider yourself as an artist first, and then also try to help other artists and institutionally align yourself. So I'll show you where I work, and I'm going to go back and forth between this slideshow as well as, thank you, as well as the internet, and just show you a few things. So I work at the Art and Culture Center in Hollywood. It is a 501c3. There are a few shows that I have coming up. Right now I have a fundraiser coming up where I have over 90 artists. They've donated to us, and we give them a membership to attend about 1,000 museums nationally, so they get something for donating to us. And then what I focus on is how to give these artists either solo shows or include them in group exhibitions throughout the year. So the next show I have coming up is called Fumare is the Color of the Adolescent Sunset. A lot of my shows have titles that are playful and fun, and it's about artists who are also professors and or worked in arts administration at some point. So one of the things that I try to focus on is how can I talk about how artists have to support themselves financially and how they really basically make our communities more robust by teaching to young artists, and also how that conflicts with their practice at times and becomes difficult. We all have a full life, if you have a full-time job and you're an artist, you have 2 careers, and then trying to fit family and friends into all that, it's a daily struggle that I know I go through and many other artists go through. And then over the summer we have a show called Personify. These are graphics. But really that's where I come from. And there's this website that I tell all artists to go to. It's called Wage. And it's working artists. And it's based on really trying to give information about institutions and how they divide their budgets. So what you do is there's a sliding scale here where you can, some of these institutions you may know about. Right now, I could go to Apex Arts or Chashima as a residency in New York, and you can kind of see how they break down their budgets. So how much do they pay you for a solo exhibition or a solo project? And both as an artist, when I write a budget for a project or I offer an opportunity to an artist, I check this site very frequently to make sure that I'm getting paid what I need to get paid, that I'm properly budgeting for the supplies, the materials, the labor. If you wanted to hire another artist to help you with the project, how much you should pay them. And really, it keeps us from abusing ourselves and from also abusing other artists or perpetually doing things for free. I always say don't work for free. I'm not giving this talk for free. You should never really work for free because you're saying basically not only will you accept less, but you're saying that artists should also accept less. And then that institution could continue to not pay artists. So that's one of my biggest areas that I think about and work on constantly. And then there's a couple of institutions that I'll mention throughout my talk that I work with as an artist. Mana Contemporary is where I have my studio. It's in downtown Miami on East Flagler Street. So I work in Broward and now live in Broward, and then my own personal work, I show a lot in Miami and outside of Miami. And then I'm involved in Dimensions Variable, which will be opening soon. They're an artist-run gallery and set of studios where, as artists, we're bonding together and helping each other write grants, work on larger projects, bring curators to our space who will show us in the future. And that's another way that you can be an advocate, is you can team up with other artists and try to create something that represents you and helps you get what you need. And to get a lot of times an institution will award a grant to a larger entity, especially a nonprofit, rather than an individual. There's less grants available for individuals than institutions. And then this looks like it's still loading, but Art Center South Florida is another institution that I recently had a residency at Miami Beach, and they always do an open call every year. And they started a huge grant funding program called the Ellie's after their founder, where you can apply. So far, it's for Miami-based artists, but a Broward artist can also collaborate with a Miami-based institution to apply for an Ellie and receive up to $10,000 in funding. So there's certain things that I like to just discuss when artists are in the room, and I consider my talks to be about myself, but also to be about the institutions that I align myself with. All right, so going into my work, I am a fiber-based artist. I work with thread, I work with embroidery, I work with some digital processes too. This piece is called Touch Tent, and it was at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Miami over the summer. It was part of their education system, their department there, so it wasn't on view in the main galleries. It was in an educational facility, and it was a weekend where students came in with their parents, and they were able to just tactilely play and enjoy the environment. And my studio is an immersive environment like this, where it's a comfortable place where you can sit and discuss, talk, see forms, touch them, and enjoy them, and inquire more about the work. And I felt throughout my education that art is often very inaccessible, that you're allowed to judge the work in relationship to yourself and the genre that it's communicating about or the symbolism. But I've always wanted people to really be with me in the space communicating. And this is what my studio looks like at Mana Contemporary. My dog is often there too. And I really just think that over time, artists have been taught that the medium is the message in their work, and that should communicate by itself. And I actually believe that the work embodies everything about you, your personal narrative, your current lifestyle, your struggles, and if we speak more openly about those things, then as a community we can better relate to each other. So here's some close-ups of the studio. So you basically walk into the studio, and I make work in the back. And this is a series I've been doing lately. This was a series of 50 banners that I made for Art Center South Florida as part of their Artist Share program. So Art Center decided to try this out for its first year, and they plan on doing it again, where you, as an artist, if you apply for it within Art Center, you make 50 objects, and then they get packaged, and basically collectors buy into this, and they pay $500, and they receive 9 artworks, which is actually, I think that that's a lot of artwork for what they paid. Almost, for me, the price is actually too inexpensive. I hope that they increase it. But I did get paid to produce the project, and it was a nice experience. I also got paid for the ICA project, and for the ICA project I made a budget. So I went to the Wage website, I looked at other institutes of contemporary art in Philadelphia, and I said, well, this is what I think my honorarium should be. It should be $1,500, and then I need a supply budget of around $3,000 to actually execute this project. And I was glad that I did. When you work with institutions, they don't always tell you what they plan on paying you, and it was a case of me saying, well, is there a budget? What is the budget? And the woman I was working with said, well, you tell us, and it's a negotiation. So I think it's important to find that information and to say, well, how do I budget this correctly so that I don't feel tension over the work that I'm producing, that I feel well paid. And then I hired an assistant, so it was really important that I had a budget to give to the other artist that I brought in who was younger than me, so that she didn't feel conflicted about working for me. And with this project, I actually had a really hard time cutting out 100 flag pieces and I was using iron-on transfer. So I hired an artist that I knew needed the money and who was looking for projects to help me for a weekend. So she helped me cut out the front and back and make some of the iron-on transfers, and then I sewed the edges and added a tassel to each of them. And they say, "Dear America, America dear," and for me they're open letters to the U.S. And as a consumer, when you receive one of these pieces, if you buy into the share program, you get to think about what you would say to America. And there are a couple feminist quotes in there too about being in an inclusive society, wanting women to be more involved in laws and lawmaking. So the work, it's intended to be poetic and it's intended to be open enough so that the person that puts their flag up actually has a point of access to it. There's a close-up. And then this is a project that I did at Bridge Red Studios, which is in North Miami, and they have an exhibition space called Under the Bridge, and it's another example of artists coming together. One of the artists owns the building and then rents it to other artists to have studios, and then they do programming every month. They have an opening tomorrow in North Miami. I think it starts at 12 and goes until 4. And one of the artists that curates there, called William Cordova, he's Peruvian and he's from Miami, he asked me to do a flag, and I was thinking about how do I talk about this institution and this flag, and thinking about the name Bridge Red, I came up with this statement, be a bridge. And I always say that to artists, like, be a bridge. Figure out how you can talk about your own work and say, this is what I do, and then also support the efforts of other artists and reference art history and be in a dialogue. I always say that art should be in discourse with something else, a community, other people. And this was something that I did for Art Week this year at Mana Contemporary. I invited these 3 other artists, Elisa Batista, who's all the way over here to the right, and then Tamara Despujols and Maria Barbas, sorry, took me a minute. Those 3 ladies, they all work with this podcast called Rocking Chair Sessions, and they invite you as an artist or any type of cultural practitioner to sit down and really talk about how you got to be where you are, what your process was, where you went to school, how you ended up in South Florida. And for me, I talked about how I ended up in South Florida for the reason that I wanted to live in a metro area where I could be both an artist and curator and not feel this constant conflict of having to choose between one career, but instead to be in this community as a dynamic person. And I find that South Florida is a place where people want culture and want to talk about their culture. So that's how I ended up here. And what we did was we did a podcast amongst our work for the community, both at Mana, and then we also did a podcast at Untitled and that art fair. And I was invited to do something at Untitled after I had a curator visit with me in my studio and tell me that my work was not saleable. And then once I told him I'm a curator, he was like, oh, maybe your institution can get involved. So I used it as an opportunity to point to my work, but to point to this community of artists who are really trying to have larger conversations about why artists make the work that they make and how it can be powerful for a community. So it was a really interesting type of programming. And then this is the work that I had with that curator from Untitled. Right now, this particular piece is at Fat Village in Fort Lauderdale at the Projects, which opens tonight. The VIP was last night. And I find Fat Village to be a really interesting district where artists are really talking about their craft. There are a lot of artists that work with laser cutting and with sculpture practices, and also can curate exhibitions for other artists. And this piece is called A Sanctuary for the Classes. And it's a space where you sit down and there are all of these textiles, mainly pom-poms, that are in your face, and you're supposed to feel like you're just in there with the modulating lights, and it's a space where you're supposed to have a conversation. And I pretty much start there with a lot of my work, like I mentioned before, and I find that last night someone came up to me and said, you know, I was sitting in there and my friend's daughter just spilled the beans on everything that she's going through this year in high school. And that's what the piece is about. It's about just letting people feel comfortable enough so they stop feeling guarded, and then they can converse in a way that's more fluid. And I started making this work pretty much a little bit before I came down to South Florida. This was the first installation I made here. but I had made one before called Lady Cave, which was a space where you also sit and there are more props that you can put on. And I made that piece right after I got through an artist displacement. I had lived in this live work studio in New Haven, Connecticut, where I attended Yale and then stayed for 5 years afterwards working with the community. And I was kicked out of this space with 100 other artists with very little notice. And it was the first time I ever felt like I was homeless for a few days. And I had family and friends nearby who took me in, but I've never before I was on vacation and I learned that my space that the fire marshals were going through and that everyone was being kicked out, and I had to come home from visiting my mom early to find that my space had been broken into and my stuff was everywhere. And it was just like, it really made me aware that a lot of artists are pretty much living on the fringes. They're trying to figure out, well, how do I have a studio practice in a commercial space and then have a living space in a residential space and not pay 2 rents, which is really expensive. And so I was trying to, at that point in my life, combine the two. And the way that it failed was this old building for 40 years in New Haven. It had been a space for artists to have that type of live workspace, but it was never properly zoned. And someone nearly burnt their apartment down, and that there was a new fire marshal in town, and it was just very swift. And I thought, like, well, what if I start making these spaces where people can talk about these things, where they can talk about how difficult it is to be an artist, or if they just want to talk about their day, but there's something about making havens for people that I find interesting. So this was my show at Locust Projects. It is a very saturated space. It was all lit with black lights. So I had tented the entire project room there, which is in the back of Locust Projects, and used material that was light sensitive, and then had above bulbs that were black lights, and then that provided a nest for these 3 installations. And it was called New Havens, both about the space that I was displaced from that kind of started me thinking about relocating, which led me to be here in South Florida working. And also this is a really fascinating community for showing installation art. People are engaged with it and they talk to you about it, and you do actually get feedback. And then the flags that I showed you earlier came out of a lot of conversations with collectors, some that were good friends of mine and some that are people I met for the first time, and they were like, it'd be good for you to think about making work that you can sell so that you can also not feel this tension. And you can still do the installations, you can do both, and you can do them in different places. So I found that the institutions that accepted these installations were wage certified, like Locust Projects, and they have an open application every year. So, and they give you a $900 stipend, and then you budget for your expenses. And then the other thing that I did that is also good for artists to know is that I went after a fabric donation, because most of my budget was actually for fabric. And then a couple came in, and I have like years worth of fabric still, but I didn't have to pay for fabric. So I was able to pay for photography services and also to pay for artists to help me with this project. So that the 10-day install, I didn't have to take off an entire 2 weeks of work. So instead I took off a few days, ended up working with a few artists. Sometimes they worked when I wasn't there, and then I would come back and check on them and also work on it myself. So it was really rewarding, because all of these projects I've shown you, they've been funded. I've gotten paid, and also I've been able to pay other artists in the process. And then this was, you can see Elisa and Maria, who I did the podcast with at Untitled. They were in that installation. So there's really this kind of web of a community that's here in South Florida that you can work with in an interdisciplinary way. And I'm going to show you a little bit of works that I've curated and then return back to my work. So I have basically a slideshow of all the work I've ever made and all the projects I've done, which is fun. Okay, so this is an article that came out in Venice magazine a year ago, and Christy Giuliano DeMott interviewed me, which was really lovely. And we talked a lot about why I came to South Florida, why I support other artists, and why I think that's important. And so the article really goes over a lot of different aspects of my life. And behind me was this installation by Susan Shutan, which I'm going to show you next, who's an artist that I knew from Connecticut when I lived in New Haven, who also has family down here in South Florida. And I found it interesting to work on a project with her and have her come here for the opening, but also to see her family. And so this is the project. And do any of you know Saul LeWitt? Yeah, Saul LeWitt is really one of the first artists in the 70s that began making work that is based on his plans. So he would write a contract essentially for each piece. And if you are a collector or a museum, you can actually employ a team of people to come and recreate the Saul LeWitt project. And this is a really important artist for Susan Shutan, who sent me a set of instructions about where to plot out which colors, and then we drilled thousands of holes into the wall and then put these wires with pom-poms on the end, and you could touch the work, and it was interactive. So I had that work up during that time of the article. And I think about that a lot, you know, how artists have lives and how their work talks about their lives, and also how you can help an artist come to you and do something in your space from outside of South Florida that can inform other artists here. It was really nice. And she also applied for an access grant. That's something else that's important for artists. If you get a solo show at the last minute with an institution that doesn't have funding, you can apply for an emergency grant to make the work. So she applied for an emergency grant with me, and so we were able to cover her flight, and then she was also able to come to the opening and to see her parents. So it worked really well in that way. This is a show called Habitat. This was a show that I installed last spring at the Art and Culture Center, and I had an artist cancel. And when I entered into my institution in 2016, there was a set of programming that I completed, and it was based on the former curator, and it was also based on my director and grant writer coming up with a few exhibitions that were partnerships with other institutions. So that's what's interesting to know about. I have a lot of artists tell me over time, you know, I sent my work in and no one ever responded to me, and I explained that a lot of institutions, because they have to write grants, for nonprofits anyway, they have to exist off of grants and state funding, they plan their exhibitions 2 years in advance. So if you're a curator, you might walk into someone else's programming for a while as you get to know the community. And for me, it was really helpful for the reason that I was new here, and also that I needed to pursue my own exhibitions outside of work. So it made me able to come in, get to know people, do the programming, plan for my future programming, and then there were some cancellations that happened along the way. So I had an artist cancel, and it was the last show that I had to complete, and I was even anxious to do my own exhibition programming. So I came up with this show called Habitat, this idea that you can inhabit an artwork, and that it's not always outside of you. You know, you can become part of the artwork, or you can complete the work itself. So the piece in the front with all these doilies is by Pip Brandt, and she's based in Hollywood. Her and her husband Dwayne are urban farmers. They're very fascinating people. They have chickens, they have ducks, they have bees, they have bunnies, and I've worked with them a lot. And Pip had been collecting all these doilies at estate sales, and then she chain stitched them together. And it was interesting to me because my grant writer is from Ukraine, and she found the one Ukrainian doily in there. It was like, look at this. This is from my home country. I want you to examine this and see the floral pattern. And she knew a lot about that particular lace pattern, which was really fascinating. And the artist behind on the wall had made these like 40-foot long tapestries when she was in a studio in a schoolhouse that she's no longer in that studio, but she had felt this freedom to make this work, and it was never exhibited, and was 10 years old at the time, and I was excited to show that work. And that artist, her name's Eurydice, she is from Lesbos. She is a lesbian. She makes a lot of work about like the power of the female body, and some of the pieces are women engaged in sexual activity, and some of them are women that are covered and also being oppressed. So she deals a lot with like the freedom of the body and taking over your own power, but also how women go through periods of oppression. And so I find the work very powerful in that way, that it represents both of those kind of paradigms for women. And then that's a close-up of the lace pattern. And I found this interesting in Pip's work, that her husband Dwayne had actually welded the framework for this. So there's kind of, for me, this like hard-edged structure that the really beautiful lace was on. This is an artist named Marina Font, and she's based in Miami Beach. She also went to Art Center, so I was showing a fellow alum. This piece I love. There's 21 pieces, and just looking at it, you can tell it's a photo of a woman. It's of the artist, so they're all self-portraits. And then there's this kind of like modernist kind of puzzle piecing of forms, and to me they look like modern houses. And I was talking to her casually as we were installing this, and she said, this work is about the 21 places that I lived before I was 18. So her parents were flipping houses in Argentina, and so she was constantly moving from place to place, and she moved more than once a year. So she wanted to talk about how she can very vaguely remember the floor plan of these spaces. So the work was really her kind of memoryscape of the layout of the places, which I thought was really fascinating. And the other thing I talk to artists about is really hone your story. Talk about who you are in the work. That is the one thing that a curator will really appreciate and be able to continue thinking about in terms of your work. So when I talk about my work, I talk about how my mom sewed and her mother sewed, and how I also sew, and that it's really a lineage that's been passed down. I don't know that my mom ever taught me how to sew, but I observed her sewing over time, and it made me want to use this language in my work, that I'm from a working class family and that we reused a lot of stuff and we recycled, and I was taught not to buy new things if I didn't have to, and now I appreciate that, because I can transform something that I wear into an interesting article of clothing, or I can make a banner that really talks about how I feel about America today, or I can just create this tactile space that people can really be part of. And that's what I found in Marina's work when she was talking to me about all of these spaces that she had lived in that she could barely recall, and that these are memory maps. I found the work very exciting, and I haven't forgotten that narrative. And then in the future, I can remember her when I'm thinking of shows. So that's a close-up, and it's all fabric on a photograph, nicely framed. And they're all the same size, so it was really like a storyboard. This work in the back of Pip Brandt's work is by an artist collective called Annie and Geddes, and they both, one is a painter and one is a fiber artist, and they basically took a tent and they deconstructed it, and then they sewed their own elements. So they made a pattern of the tent, which I thought was interesting. And then when you were sitting inside it, you could see out to all the other installations. And I was joking with a lot of my colleagues that I needed a place to hide. That's why I put this piece in there. That sometimes when you're at an opening, there's so many people talking to you about various things that you actually need a space to just breathe. So this space really provided that. And this is really old work by Karen Reifus. She's a painter. She just had a show at the Bass this past spring in Miami Beach. She made this work in the 90s called No Bullshit. So she took pop lights, which were kind of newer at the time. Now we would be like, oh, that's outdated technology. But at the time, this was kind of a new, sort of, improve your closet lighting technology that's battery operated. And it's like interesting because this was the work that required the most maintenance in that exhibition, because the pop lights, like every now and then they would just stop working, like one would expire. And then I bought a lot of rechargeable batteries. I started feeling guilty about using throwaway batteries. And so she had just basically taken the cover off and she had silk screened some of them to say no bullshit. So I thought this was really powerful today about our current administration. That she was trying to talk about how we are in an administration that's not really an inclusive one, where we don't talk about inclusivity on a kind of political scale. We talk about it more within like humanitarian groups. So she really wanted to say, like, as a viewer, you can have agency to say this is bullshit and push the button, or actively say no, or it's a playful piece. This work is by another collective called RPM, and the letters stand for Rhonda, Patricia, and Marina. So that artist that had the Memoryscapes pieces, she also participated in this. And the three women got together, and they all have families, and they were like, what if we made a work that was about sitting at the table, sort of like a Judy Chicago table on a smaller, more domesticated scale, and just talked about like what they face as women. So each one of these monitors on the chair is a different woman talking about her family. So there's one woman this would stick in my mind because she would always say, it's perfect! And so you'd walk into the gallery and you'd hear that. That woman would talk about all the things that she caught herself saying in automatic mode without thinking. So with her kids, she'd say, oh, it's perfect, or, oh, I don't care. And she would go through that like monologue, a set of monologues. And then one woman was talking about like how no matter what she does, she just doesn't feel beautiful anymore. She just feels like her beauty has expired. And ironically, the one on the left, she was very gorgeous in that portrait, that video portrait. And you're meant to hear all this clamoring, which represents the daily lives of these women as they pick up their kids, and then they finally get into the studio and then they have no energy left, or they are going to so many sporting events that they can't remember where they're supposed to be next, or they started hating shopping because they could be spending time reading a book instead of shopping, and you just hear all this bustling. And the artists, they made their own cupcakes, they made all of these fake cakes, and what I liked the most was the video and this talking back and forth and creating this shared space to discuss issues, which relates to my own work, that I want people to really be able to access the work and to not feel removed from it. And there's one chair at this table where you can also sit as a viewer, and you could talk about your own story if you wanted to, or you can make an entry in their blog and say what you thought about the piece. It's another Karen Rifus piece. If you put a quarter in that, this piece will take your money, which I think is a poetic statement about the Catholic Church and how we put our faith and blind devotion into an institution that doesn't really give back to us. So she made this during the time of all the different controversies, and I think it's playful also, and that's important when you're making work about any political subject or feminist commentary or a commentary about social issues. I think the element of play is really important so that the viewer potentially has access to it, can participate, or even thinks about that idea of participation and what it means. I've printed with him at Art Center South Florida. He's a resident there now. He made a series of tents that were mirrored and multiplied, and that really talked about this like idea of an expanding structure. So it worked with Habitat. Here's more of Eurydice's work, kind of close-ups of it. So some of the women are like showing off or undressing, or also being bound. This is her Laconian work. She references a lot of Greek mythology in her work, which makes sense with her cultural background and also as an artist looking at art history and making it her own. This is another exhibition that I had up at the same time. So there's 3 spaces at the Art and Culture Center, and I compare it to locust projects a lot too. That you have 3 different types of experiences when you visit. So Sri Prabha, he's Indian and he's based in Hollywood. he makes a lot of work that's about taking a memory of an object and making it seem otherworldly and creating your own spaces within the work. And he has a lot of interests in science, the arts and the sciences, and also like meditation. This was kind of a meditative space where you were encouraged to sit and actually have a moment with yourself. And so it was also a little bit of a cosmic experience. And the work was called, the show was called Origin. So thinking about how, as an artist, you can actually take an everyday object, look at it almost in like a fluxus way, and expand upon it and turn it into your own universe. And at the same time, I had a show up called Plush, and I left that as a little bit of an open-ended, open call where if you work in any type of soft material or reference it, you could be potentially included in this show. And I included these carpet pieces by Carrie Phillips, who's based in Miami. And she also is an Art Center South Florida alum. She made this work based on family portraits where she erased the face of the figures. And when I first looked at this work, I thought it was also, in a similar way to Marina Fonts, this idea that your memory is different from the actual like photographic evidence of it, so that you might not remember that you were making that scared face or a silly face in a photo. And then what I liked about it is that you can really tell that this photo is from the 90s, from all of the different patterns and textures. And you can tell that one shirt might be velour and the other shirt is silk. So it was interesting how she treated, and it's all made out of carpet, so she's cut out different carpets to reconstruct this family portrait. And then the next works, I'm not going to talk about every one, but they all involve some kind of dialogue between soft and hard materials. So I like this idea that like you can protect yourself, and that whenever there is a negative thought pointed toward you or a negative action, that you can just send it right back. You just send it right back to the person, or you cast it, even better, you just cast it out entirely. So I've always liked this symbolism and this philosophy that, and I think about it quite a lot in communities because I really do go through a lot of different things in these community environments. And it's important to be a peacemaker, but also to stand up for yourself and to continue to develop your own narrative. So that's like a symbol that I repeat. And I like this idea that you can sit on one of these and bounce around or enjoy it for what it is, that it is part utilitarian and also symbolic. And I sold one this past year to a collector in Miami, and it's in her home. And it was a nice experience for me because I had gone through, and this is a narrative that I talk openly about, whenever I've shown artwork for free, I've often had my work come back damaged or ended up stressing out one of the people who organized it, or I've had a lot of bad experiences around free opportunities, and these works came back to me. I participated in something during Art Week, and they came back with gum all over them. So I spent about 6 months repairing them for this show, and then I sold one, and I was like, oh, okay, good, because I recouped the money that I had and the time that I had put into them. But that's another thing I tell artists, is just make sure that when you actually work with someone to show your work, that it's in good care, that you're not donating your work and your time, but you're standing up for yourself and creating these spaces that people can enjoy, but also maintaining the quality of your work. This is the Lady Cave in another institution. This was at the Bailey Center for Contemporary Arts up in Pompano. So that's a space where artists also have studios. You'll see that there's one behind to the right of this image. And that was interesting to have them work like with another's. It was a group show that Lisa Rockford did. She also has one of the houses here for Art Fort Lauderdale. And the show was called Gritty and Pink. So it was all about artists using the color pink to either subvert its original gender message, or to just embrace it, or to even make work that's like ugly in pink. So it was an interesting commentary. So a lot of this work, this is actually going back to New Haven now. I've shown you a lot of the work that I've had here in different South Florida institutions, and for a while I ran a space that was a kind of pop-up gallery called No Pop in New Haven, and I, at one point in my life, after that first studio displacement, I decided to run an artist-run space with a partner for a year within New Haven and see how it went. And I've always been interested in metro areas and communities that are on the fringes of major cities. So I think of Fort Lauderdale as a place where Miami's not that far from it, Hollywood's right in between, and how can you really work with different communities. So here I was working with a Yale community of students who went to Yale and the poor aspects of New Haven, and then the small cultural institutions that exist within New Haven, and bringing all those people together in a space that is a live space, although I would lock off my living spaces, studio, and then also a gallery. I found it very hard to do this endeavor. I think that anytime you combine a few aspects of what you do, you really learn about what you don't enjoy doing, and you learn about what you really are passionate about, but you also really kind of challenge what your live space is and what personal space means to you, and I went through that during this project. I found that I had a hard time living in commercial spaces. It's the last time I ever lived in one because I just missed sunlight and basic things, but it was a beautiful project. And that same installation went into the Ely Center for Contemporary Art, which at the time, this is another interesting narrative about the fragility of art spaces. This was a really beautiful Victorian house that became an art institution after the Elys died and they had an estate, and they managed it so that they had a board of trustees that would ensure that it was an arts organization. And they hired a curator, and he lived in the house at the very top. So the bottom floor was all exhibition space, and the top was an apartment that he lived in. And he ended up getting employed when he was in his late 20s, and he lived there until he was in his 60s. But what happened was the board of trustees slowly died off. They passed away. And then it was only him managing really the exhibitions, so he didn't have time to raise money and really be a active director who was really fundraising. So the TD Bank actually, or no, it was Wells Fargo, they actually closed the Ely Center, which was really sad for the community of New Haven. This was one of the oldest galleries there. And as a community of artists, we signed a petition, and we spent months advocating, about 6 months advocating to reopen this space. So it still doesn't have a director, but it does now have a board of directors. So the space is actually, this was the first exhibition that happened in that space after it closed, and I was happy to be part of it. And I'm glad that it's still continuing as a space, that it's still a center for art. But it did go through a period of time where it almost ended, and if no one had advocated for it, it wouldn't be an arts institution. So it's interesting how, as an artist, you do have power in numbers if you collaborate with other artists, in this case, the city of artists that really needed this space. And, or if it's just on a more individual level where you open your own studio with artists, but you really do have to kind of hang in there sometimes. There are rough patches for sure in any artist's career. This work I did at the time of one of my displacements. So I think the one thing that is really valuable for artists is a lot of times when you go through a difficult period, you make art because you really feel like it's the one thing that will keep you from getting depressed or from feeling really, unoptimistic. So this work, it says "Dream Diversely," and the flag is 15 feet long. And I found that right after I was displaced from the studio live space, before I started No Pop, which I last talked about, I had to live temporarily in a space that I had a realtor friend, and she called me up when this happened, and she's like, "How can I place you somewhere?" And I was looking for affordable rent, and I had had a lot of expenses come up. So I lived upstairs, and another couple lived below me from the same building, so we ended up filling up this house, and she received a commission for it, and we also were placed within like a couple weeks into this place. But the weirdest thing about it was that the exterior of the house was completely stripped and wasn't painted yet, and it looked like no one lived there. But on the inside, the developer had completely renovated. So my apartment was really nice inside, but I'd find people sitting on the stoop when I came back from work, and the community didn't know yet that this place was remodeled. So, it was hard to go through that after a displacement, but then it was also really interesting to me to talk to people and to get to know a community. And I was always struck by the mailbox had Papa written on it in vinyl in really big letters, and I always wondered who Papa was. And throughout the course of making this work, I would think about it, I would talk to someone about it, and I researched who this guy was because I was really curious. And I found out that Papa was this guy who was a very quirky businessman that had a florist shop right up the street, and that he would sell flowers to the people that were visiting their family members in the hospital across the street. And so I found out that he was part of really a group of people who got into development and that started the first artist assisted living space in New Haven. So it's ironic, here I am, I'm in his house years later, he's passed on, and sometimes his son would come and get this mail that would come to the house, and then I'm making this flag, and I was feeling really down in this current moment because I had lost a really functional, beautiful live space that I had put money into, and I just said to myself, I'm just gonna continue what I was making when I was displaced, and one day I'll just air this out. So I just measured from the top of my balcony down to the street, realized it was 15 feet, realized it needed to be 86 inches across, and I just made the flag and put it outside one day. And I made a video, I paid my friends to make a video about it, and I met the whole community that day. And then I met the government entity in my neighborhood, it's called Chapel West, who pretty much are in charge of beautifying that neighborhood. And one of them came up to me and was like, this piece is really very interesting because this guy Papa, who owned this house, he always would have an American flag with him, and he'd wave it around. And he was the type of guy that every year dressed up as Santa for the lighting of the town tree for Christmas. And it was really shocking to me because he showed me the material that they had printed of Papa's legacy, and there was a photo of him with an American flag. And it was really one of these moments where you're like, how is this happening? It's so coincidental that I'd be making this work and that I would air it out one day and that I would meet my community. And it was really pretty beautiful in that sense. It was one of those moments that I won't forget, and that also made me want to keep making art, and I showed this piece here with Lisa Rockford up in West Palm Beach at the Moore collection. This was outside, so it had a very different kind of feeling from its point of origin to being on a white cube, But so this is a piece that's kind of traveled around with me, and
The first one is different, right? Yes.
this is the same flag.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it went from being outside in this neighborhood that was a very mixed neighborhood between working class white, black, and Hispanic people to kind of showing it for what it is. And I think it had more power here, even though it looks, more clean here. So I'll show you a couple more things, and then I want to open it up a little bit for questions. This is a flag that I made for Locust Projects called Own Your Displacement. I think that it's one of those pieces that isn't complete in terms of its message, but I liked this idea, during that time of owning the displacement, being able to tell the story, and relate to other people who've been displaced, whether they went through a spatial displacement like I did, or whether they've gone through displacement as an immigrant, or I think that talking about the larger issues is not something that you should be ashamed about in your work. I think it's actually very powerful, and it gives a chance to really build community within the work itself. And then one of my goals in the upcoming year is to make flags with the community. So at NANA, I'll be doing a series of workshops where the community comes in and they sketch with fabric and make kind of statements for flags, and then flags are made out of community statements. So that's something that I plan on doing. And then over the summer, I went to Italy. I went to Siena. And another thing that I haven't talked about much is residencies. I've talked more about exhibitions and institutional support and mobilizing yourselves as teams, but also residencies are another way that artists connect with communities. And I had researched Tuscany. I taught in Tuscany 3 years ago through the University of New Haven, which was the gallery director job I had before working as the curator at the Art and Culture Center in Hollywood. And I knew that Tuscany was rich for textile designs. And while I was teaching there, I was teaching a design class in the community, and we did an installation as a group. And we did a lot of research about a local mural and executed it with different materials. And I was like, wow, I'm in a textile industry here. If I walk to Chinatown from Prato in Italy, I literally, if I walk to Chinatown, I can see the factories where textiles are produced. And I learned that that felt and wool, the wool industry crashed, and the fashion industry crashed in the early 2000s. So a lot of the factories, the Italian factories, were abandoned, and everyone went out of business. And then the Chinese immigrated there and owned their own businesses there, producing Italian designs. So it's kind of an interesting, like, cultural melding of these two communities. So I wanted to go back as an artist, because the first time I was teaching, and I found it really hard to engage with the communities there. And a lot of artists live in like Florence, or they don't necessarily live in these small towns in Tuscany, but they might be from these small towns. And so I went to Siena, and I actually studied flags and textiles. And Siena is a very like beautiful place where a famous horse race happens twice in the summer, in July and August. And the 17 neighborhoods, they compete to win the Palio. And so all summer I saw each community wearing their own flags, like parading the streets, practicing for the Palio. And I went to each neighborhood's museum and looked at the symbolism and looked at how these flags were made. So it was a really, really culturally enriching time for me. So that's another thing that you can do in tassel designs. And this was my studio where I borrowed a staff person's mother's sewing machine, which was really wonderful. And I like to do that if I can, instead of like buying a new machine that I'm not going to bring back. I like to use someone's machine that's like stuck in a box. So this machine hadn't really seen the light of day for 5 years or so, and I had a really good time taking it apart and not telling anyone, because you can turn a basic sewing machine into an embroidery machine if you take out the feet of it, and then you put on a special attachment, and you can. So I would embroider on this machine, and I didn't break it, so I was very happy about that. And then I bought some oil for it and some other things that I returned, and a thank you note to her mother, and it was really nice. And I think, so I made the flags behind, and I spent a lot of time just like sewing every day and getting into my craft and doing local research. So that's something, as an artist, I highly recommend. Going to residencies, engaging with community. It can be hard if you work. It took me 6 months to plan being away for 6 weeks. So a month per week of convincing the team at the Art and Culture Center that it's a valuable thing for me personally, but that it also reflects back onto the institution in a positive way. And also, as an artist who's an administrator, I don't have to feel tension in my practice if I also get to pursue it in a very focused way. And then also you meet people that you stay in touch with. that follow your work and who you become pen pals with, or digital pen pals with, and so yeah, that's the range of what I do, and I work full time. I do residencies every once in a while. I do local residencies and work within the community that I'm in, and then make my own work, and then also encourage other artists to produce and try to pay them for what they do. So any questions?
You mentioned before that you applied for grants.
Yeah.
Where do you apply for them? In this county or Miami? Or Dade
Oh,
County?
both. So there's, the county websites are really useful. There's a public art and design committee in Broward, so if you do public art, there's a lot of opportunities for public art. And then there's national grants, like the National Endowment for the Arts, where you partner with an organization to apply.
What is that? The last one?
The National Endowment for the Arts, that's a big one, that's a very competitive one. And then some of these residencies also offer assistance with your flight, where you live and work, covering those fees. And I always say to actively look for them. There's a website called Trans Artists, which lists all of the, from the major residencies to the more local ones, and institutions also sign up to be part of that directory. So there's large directories like that, Trans Artists, and the grants within Broward and also Miami-Dade Cultural Affairs is another place that I would check. So it depends. If you're based in Broward, if you live in Broward, you should go to the Broward Cultural Division and look for their opportunities. If you're based in Miami, the Miami Cultural Division. And then institutions like Locust Projects, they provide a stipend if you're accepted as an artist. The Art and Culture Center where I work, I have some open calls. I have a couple open calls. I have a rotating open call where you can just send me a proposal. I often say that when you are trying to get opportunities as an artist, to go and frequent the openings of the institutions that you're interested in, because then that shows the curators there that you're a serious artist and that you really want to show there and that you want to get involved. That's usually the starting point, and that helped me get involved with a lot of the institutions that I'm at, like Dimensions Variable, which is an artist-run space. I went to every opening that they had for a year, and then they included me in a show, and then now I'll be renting space from them and working with them on projects. So it's like, I think of it as a conversation, between two people, that you're trying to get to know an institution much like you would get to know a person.